Well, hello, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to be discussing E-rate invoicing. This is also just a final sound check for anyone. Hopefully you can tell by looking at your screen if I'm speaking. If not, if you can't hear, please email or Cindy Landers at clanders@bcoe.org, or you can type into the Q&A or the chat function, and that'll alert me as well. So as I stated, we're going to be talking about E-rate invoicing and specifically the billed entity applicant reimbursement process. Today's training is brought to you by the California K-12 High Speed Network. My name is Rachel White, and I've provided my contact information for you on slide 2 in the event that you have additional questions or you need some more specific guidance on an issue you may be dealing with. Please feel free to email me at any time, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So the items that we're going to be discussing today are the two types of invoicing within the E-rate system. We'll also be talking about how do you identify which funding requests belong to which type of invoicing. We'll briefly go over how to reconcile your expenses specific to the BEAR form, how to prepare the BEAR form, and then what happens next once you finally get your form submitted. So let's move on to talk about the two types of invoicing. The first one, which we won't spend a lot of time on today, is related to the FCC Form 474. It's also called the SPI form, or the Service Provider Invoice. This method allows you, or allows the service provider to put the discounts on your bills so that you only pay the discounted portion. That's in the perfect world. Obviously, with E-rate being the animal that it is, there may be months of the year that you pay the full bill up front, but then you'll get a retroactive reimbursement once your discounts start kicking in. Now, in order for you to participate in the SPI method, you have to actively select that method. You have to let your service provider know that that's what you want. Many service providers have forms for you to identify that method. Some are called a grid, others may be called a data gathering form. But keep in mind that this is the method that's required if you are also participating in the CTF fund. Now, you might say, well, how do we know if we have to participate in a SPI method if we're getting CTF? Well, CTF doesn't cover all of the same services that E-rate does. So slide 6 shows us specifically what services CTF covers. And if you're receiving any of these services, such as measured business line service, ISDN, T1, DS3s, Internet access, MPLS, and so on, if you're receiving these from an eligible carrier, you're likely receiving the CTF discount. I've also provided on slide 6 a list of qualifying service providers. Now keep in mind that just because you're receiving a qualifying service doesn't mean that the service provider you're receiving it from qualifies to participate in the CTF program. So you kind of have to pair those two together in order to first determine if your service should be getting CTF discount, and secondly, to help you determine if you should be using the E-rate SPI method for those discounts. So now we're going to talk about a little bit more of the meat and potatoes of today's presentation. And we're really jumping into one of the final processes related to an E-rate cycle, which is the invoicing. So if there's anything that I share with you that leaves you a little bit lost because you're not extremely familiar with the rest of the process, please feel free to reach out to me. We will be having some in-depth training later this month as well as the beginning of next year that'll cover the whole process. So moving on now to the BEAR form, the FCC Form 472. This is where you pay your entire bill up front, you submit the BEAR form, and then you end up, in the end, getting a discount check or a refund check from your service provider. The way that works is once you file your Form 472 or BEAR form, and USAC approves it, then USAC sends the funds to the service provider. The service provider then has 20 days from the receipt of those funds to get them back to you in the form of a check. The services that are commonly associated with a BEAR form would be things like long distance. Long distance doesn't qualify for the CTF discount, so it makes it a very likely service that you would use a BEAR form on. Wireless, as well as some internet access services. Now, I do want to just mention a caveat on wireless. Remember, we're talking right now about the 2014-15 funding year. 2014-15 was the last funding year that included wireless being eligible in the manner that we've always been used to. Beginning with 2015, when the modernization order took effect, the FCC decided that wireless was not the most cost-effective way to receive internet access to any given location. So keep in mind that wireless is mentioned here strictly for the use of 2014-15 funding year. So now that we've talked about the two types of invoicing, let's go on to identify our funding request. How do we know which one really should be a SPY and which one should be a BEAR? Well, to do that, it would be helpful to know what all of our funding requests are. So we're going to use a tool provided by USAC called the Data Retrieval Tool, also known as the DRT. That tool is located at USAC's website. Once you land on the home page, click on Search Tool, which shows up on the left side of the page toward the bottom. The next screen will give you the opportunity to click on Data Retrieval Tool. When we get there, and we'll show you exactly what this looks like in a moment, information that you'd want to have handy is your billed entity number. You want to know what funding year you're searching. And my recommendation is that you select all data points. This will help you avoid being in a situation where you thought you selected everything you needed, only to find out you missed one, and then you have to start all over again. So let's take a look at what this looks like as we go online. Here we are now at USAC's main page. As stated earlier, we're going to click on Search Tools, which is on the left side of the page. Once we click on Search Tools, we'll then select the Data Retrieval Tool. Here we come to the point where we can select a lot of parameters individually, or as I mentioned, we're going to just select the Select All feature. But let's start with the funding year. First, we want to select the proper funding year, which is 2014. The reason I'm focused on 2014 is that the 2014-15 year specifically relates to the upcoming deadline that we have this month of October 28th. You have to enter the state, otherwise it doesn't really want to pull the report down. So we enter the state, and then we enter our entity number. And for the sake of our demonstration today, we're going to pick on Butte County Office of Ed. Now you'll notice in the next section, it has a lot of different boxes already checked, and you're fine to leave them that way. There's no reason to limit what you're searching for. In section 2, it says optional criteria. We are not going to enter anything into that section at all. We would like to see this report come in an Excel format, which is already selected. And now at the very bottom, we have that checkbox that allows us to select data points. Now, as I scroll down the screen, you will notice all of the different options you have of data points. And there's quite a few, which is what leads to being able to easily forget one. So I recommend selecting at the top, select all data points. Once you click on that, then you'll scroll back to the bottom of the screen and then click on Build Data File. You'll notice that it downloaded for us. And once we open it, we have a spreadsheet that is about 54 columns wide. It's a lot of information. Now, we aren't going to go through every column, but I wanted to show you what the spreadsheet looks like. What I've done is I have already downloaded this spreadsheet, and I've hidden the columns that we're not going to work with. But just to give you a general idea, the tab that we're looking at right now, just so you kind of know how this is laid out. The first few columns talk about the actual applicant. Your funding, your forms, your funding request numbers, Form 470, 471. The next group of columns, columns F through M, tells you who you're talking about. So you can confirm that you actually entered the correct entity ID number. Columns N through O, specific to the service provider. This is where you can identify the service provider ID number or the SPIN, as well as the service provider itself. Column P is the one we all like to see, gives us our funding commitment status, and in this case, they were all funded. Column R, we're going to talk specifically about a little further in training. That's the service start date. And what's interesting is columns W through AH, that's a lot. Those are all details specific to what you originally put on your Form 471 before you went through the PIA review process. And as many of you know, after going through that process, things are subject to change. And once they change, then they'll show up in columns AI through AZ as the actual committed information as opposed to original. So in column W that I have highlighted, it says this is the original FRN service type. There will be another column at the end of this report that says committed FRN service type. So just so you know, that's kind of how this whole spreadsheet's laid out. And I will say I'll be sharing these slides with you all at the end of the presentation, and I do have in one of the slides a breakdown of how this spreadsheet is laid out, just for your reference, so you didn't have to take notes that quickly as I sped through that. So before we analyze the rest of this, let's just go back and take a look at a couple of requirements. Here's the reference layout as I mentioned earlier. A couple of prerequisites to invoicing. Number one, you have to have funding approval. We're going to take a look at column P that says commitment status. We just highlighted that a moment ago and we saw that they were all funded. Number two is your Form 486 has to be filed and certified. We're going to take a look at column R, which is entitled 486 SSD or service start date. We'll talk about that as we switch back over to the actual spreadsheet. And the third thing that must happen is you must submit your bear form by the deadline. How do we know what the deadline is? Column V, last date to invoice, tells us what that deadline is. So let's head back out to that spreadsheet. Let me just pull open the correct spreadsheet. So we mentioned column R, Form 486 service start date. And I'll see if I can make this a little bit bigger. The Form 486 service start date will only be populated if a 486 has been certified. And if it was submitted and certified on time, the earliest date you'll have here is a July 1st date. Now there are reasonable scenarios that would make this date later, but there's no reasonable scenario that makes it earlier. So at least you know by looking at this column that your 486 was submitted and certified on time. Now column V, last date to invoice, you notice we have basically two different dates in this column. The earliest date is October 28, 2015. The latest being January 28, 2016. So you might wonder, so why the difference? Well, this date is based on your last day of services. For recurring services, your last day to receive them is June 30th of any given funding year. So 120 days after that, you have to have all of your invoicing submitted. 120 days after June 30th takes us to October 28th. For non-recurring services, your last date to receive those services is September 28th September 30th. So we count 120 days after that last day, and that's what brings us to the January 28th deadline. So there's a basic rule for you. 120 days after your last date to receive service is the deadline for filing the BEAR form. So now that we've determined that, we see exactly who our funding requests are issued to, all of our service providers. That's when we want to go through and try to balance out which ones are already giving us the CTF discount. If they are giving us that discount, then likely, if we scroll all the way to the end of this report, under invoicing mode, we're going to see it's indicated SPI, Service Provider Invoice. Those are the ones that are giving us, we are hoping that they're giving us the CTF discount. That's something I encourage you to confirm that on a regular basis, because some providers that slips in and out of their system. So confirm that you're getting all of the discounts that you should be getting. The ones that we really want to pay attention to are the ones that say not set. And if we hadn't filed any of our BEAR forms yet, we'd have every single one of these that currently says BEAR would say not set, because that means nothing's been done with them yet. So let's just take a look at one of the BEARs that had been submitted for Butte and kind of walk ourselves through that process. I've highlighted for us row 8, and as we scroll back over, we're going to see who that's related to. We see that's connected to AT&T Corp. Now, AT&T Corp is traditionally the long-distance provider connected to our PacBell or CalNet 3 contract. There are other options, but when you see it in your E-rate funding, that's most likely who it is and what it's for. Having said that, if you have a difficult time looking at this report and knowing what the service is, I encourage you to go back to your Form 471. There's often a lot more detail provided in that form than what you'll see here, specific to what the service is. Look at your Item 21 attachment if you have access to that, and that should give you exactly what the service is. Again, just more tools for you to help determine which funding requests need to have the BEAR form filed. So we're going to focus on our long-distance service, AT&T Corp. We know that they were funded, and we know that they were funded at 90%, because this report tells us that. Notice in column AT, it says 90, and that's the committed discount percent. So we're going to go back now and figure out, well, how much money should we be expecting based on our invoices, the bills that we've paid all year long? We've talked about these prerequisites. Now we'll talk about reconciling our expenses. So you definitely want to reconcile your expenses as if you were expecting an audit. The reason being, as we all know, it's very difficult to go back and recreate a situation or what was going on at any given time, as opposed to doing it in the moment. So things that we want to document. Who's the service provider? What are the invoice dates? If it's a recurring service, it's very likely we're going to have at least one invoice for every month of the year. What are the total charges? The last thing we'd want to do is be sure to identify all of the ineligible charges. It's not good enough simply not to count them. We have to prove that we actually identified them. So include that on your spreadsheet when you're reconciling these expenses. Some of the ineligible charges that you'll notice are things such as administrative expense fees. If you're looking at a cellular bill, it could be individual app fees. It could be perhaps a maintenance fee on your phone that you have, or insurance on your phone. Those would be fees that you need to look for and be sure that you identify and remove them from what's eligible. Here we have on slide 15 a very brief example of what a reconciliation could look like. Obviously, we only have 4 months listed here. And the truth is you could file a BEAR form as often as you like, so it could be that you're filing one only for 4 months. But if you're filing one for the whole year, please be sure that you list all of the invoices affecting this particular reimbursement. At the top of the screen, we've identified some basic information. Our funding year is 2014. This reconciliation is related specifically to AT&T for the service of long distance. Our discount percentage is 90%, and our total funding cap is $8,502.84, which means we cannot exceed that. Doesn't matter if our expenses exceed it, we can. If our expenses are less than that, then wonderful. That means we got all the funds that we are entitled to. If our expenses exceed it, then it looks like we undershot ourselves on the application. So you'll notice we have our total charges column, and we've identified our ineligible charges. I would also encourage you to make a note on your spreadsheet what those ineligible charges consist of. You will find as you go from vendor to vendor, those ineligible charges are consistently labeled the same, so it gets easier and easier to recognize what they are. For AT&T's long distance, one of the most common one is that administrative expense fee. So you'll just start recognizing what those ineligibles are. Because you won't find anywhere a list that tells you specifically for each service provider what their ineligible fees are, if you find yourself in a quandary, you can certainly email me. But the other option you have is to email a copy of your bill to the Client Service Bureau and have them identify for you what those ineligible fees are. That way you'll have it in writing from the source, and then you can move forward with confidence. So now that we've identified all of our eligible charges as well as the ineligible ones, we're ready to prepare our BEAR form. The information you're going to need specific to that form: your billed entity number, your billed entity name, service provider ID number, the 471 application number, your funding request, your discount percentage, and your total eligible cost. There's two ways to file this form. We're going to spend more time on the paper method because that's what everyone has access to. The paper method can be found online. You go to USAC's website, again to their main page, click on Forms on the left side, then select FCC Form 472, where you can then download both the form and the specific instructions. So let's go ahead and take a look at that form. Here we are again, back at USAC's web landing page. On the left side, we're going to click on Forms. And then toward right in the center of the page, we have the FCC Form 472. Once we click there, it is actually going to give us a fillable form, which is very nice. So walking through this form, the very first section that we have is the applicant form identifier. That's completely up to you. Whatever is a great reference point for you is what I encourage you to put there. Given that you may be filing multiple forms, I encourage you to put something in there that's actually meaningful and not just simply funding year 2015 BEAR Form 2. If you put something in there that gives you an idea of perhaps who the service provider is or what the service is, that might be more useful to you as you're glancing through your forms in the future. So for our case, funding year 2014, I'm going to put my agency's initials in there. I'm going to put LD for long distance. As you notice, once we tabbed, it skipped over the part that says FCC Form 472 invoice number. That's a number specifically assigned to this form by the Schools and Libraries Division. So let's enter the billed entity name. And you can tab through this form, which is nice. It does save time. Now remember, actually, all of the information contained here, aside from the very first field we filled out, can be found on the data retrieval tool. As soon as I say that, I'm trying to retract my words because the contact information is not on the data retrieval tool. But all of the other identifying numbers are available there. Our total reimbursement, we would know that from our reconciliation. We knew what our total expenses were. We applied our discount after removing all of the ineligible items, which is what allowed us to come up to our total billed the amount that we're expecting in discounts. See if I can get this to work. And as I'm trying to type it in now, I'm realizing because this is an online fillable form, that's going to auto-populate for us once we fill in the next page, which is block 2, where we put in our specific expense information. So block 2, item 7 is asking for our form 471 application number. So we enter that information. And then we enter our funding request number. Notice that it skipped right over column 9. So we're now at column 10. What is the customer bill date? It's very important that you get this date correct, because if it doesn't line up, then it can be kicked out of USAC's system, and we don't want to run the risk of you ending up not getting this form processed and possibly missing a deadline. This date must land within the funding year that we're talking about. So customer bill date, we're going to put in there July 2014. That's when our billing started. The ship date would apply more towards services that are tangible, like your Category 2 services that you may be receiving. Item 12, undiscounted amount for service. So what was that total undiscounted amount for us? And be sure and enter the undiscounted amount that has removed all of the ineligible services. Now we're going to enter our discount percent, and there we have it auto-calculating what our funding request, the amount of money we're expecting to receive back from the service provider, $1,490 and pretty much 68 cents. Notice how it auto-populated in the screen above, right here, auto-populated that for us. Now you can enter multiple funding requests as long as it is for the same service provider. The next screen we're going to fill out is block 3, the billed entity certification. This is where you will put your authorized signer's information, title, position, phone number, and address. That's where you stop. There's one more page to this form, but as an applicant, you do not fill this out. This last page is saved, it's set aside for the service provider. The service provider has to acknowledge this form, and they do so by signing this page. Going back to our slide, we'll see exactly on slide 19, just reminders that you as the applicant, you're going to fill out blocks 1, 2, and 3. You save block 4 for the service provider. Once you have this form filled out, you're going to fax it to the service provider so that they can acknowledge it. You can also email it to the service provider. Either way works just fine. But your next question might be, well, how do I know where to send it? You know your service provider, and a lot of service providers are huge. You may send it to the wrong place and it ends up sitting on someone's desk and nothing ever happens with it and you end up missing the deadline. That would not be a great scenario. So let's see exactly how do we find out who we contact at the service provider. We're going to go to the search tool specific to service providers and see if we can find their contact information. So let's go back to USAC's website. Again, we're going to click on Search Tools, which is on the left side of the screen. Right in the center, it says Bins and Spins. We're going to click on the one that says Search for Spin Information. On the following screen, it gives us the idea or the option to put in either the service provider's name, which may be helpful, especially if we don't know the whole name or we don't know really what their service provider ID is. You can use a wildcard, which is the %, and search. Just know ahead of time, you're probably going to get quite a lengthy response as far as your search goes. In this particular case, we know what the service provider's ID number is because we have it on our data retrieval tool. So scroll down and click Next. We come to the page that then provides us with the contact information. It says Lorraine Griffin. The phone number in an odd format, but nonetheless the phone number, is under Contact Phone. But there's something else that I want to highlight on this screen. It's this very last column. It says SPAC filed, Service Provider Annual Certification. In order for the rest of this process to work and for you to actually see your funding, your service provider must have a current SPAC on file. If, when you look up their contact information, you do not see a current one on file, then you need to contact your service provider anyway and ask them to file one. Otherwise, you will not receive your funding. So now that we've contacted the service provider, we've sent them the form, they've sent it back to us, then what? Well, then you're going to mail it to USAC. The address is provided on slide 21. You want to be sure that you mail it via a trackable mailing, whether it's USPS, UPS, FedEx. It doesn't matter which one, as long as it's trackable so you can show not only when you mailed it, but when the Schools and Libraries Division received it. Now, we also mentioned that there's an online BEAR process. To use the online BEAR process, which is more convenient if you have a pen, it's more convenient only then. If you don't have a pen, I can't guarantee how quickly you'll get one, since this whole process is being transitioned due to the modernization order. Once the new process is put in place, then we will provide you some training on it. But if you don't have a pen, then I suggest that you use the BEAR form. But for those of you who do have a pen, using the online system is quite simple. You will still need the same information as what you needed on the BEAR form, except that it will be sent straight to your service provider, and you won't need to print off any papers and fax them or email them to your service provider. And then the process is just a little more streamlined by using the online BEAR. But to show you how to get to that online BEAR, we'll go back to USAC's homepage. And at the middle of the left side menu, it says Apply Online. We'll click there and scroll down a little ways. On the far right of the screen, we have Utilities, and then it says BEAR Online. Once we click to the online BEAR, we enter our billed entity number, the PIN, which is typically assigned to the authorized signing person. There's also a PIN for BEAR-only users. If you are a BEAR-only user, then you likely know exactly what that is, what that means. You'll enter your email address, last name, and then click Login, and just fill in the information as it's requested. So success, you've either filed your BEAR online or you've submitted your BEAR via paper. Then what? The next steps, USAC is going to review your BEAR. To them, a BEAR is an invoice. So that's why we call this E-rate invoicing. To USAC, a BEAR or a SPI, either one, is an invoice. Well, they might request that you provide them some backup documentation to support your figures. So be prepared for that. That's the very reason we encourage you to do the spreadsheet straight from your bills and to maintain that documentation. Once USAC has reviewed your request and approved it, then they will issue the funding to the service provider, who then has the 20 days to get those funds back to you. They will also issue what's called a BEAR notification letter. That will tell you exactly how much you were approved for. It will restate all of your information that you put in your BEAR, such as who the service provider is, what you called your BEAR invoice, the actual invoice number is assigned by USAC. That BEAR notification letter is something that you want to put in your E-rate files and hang on to. It serves as acknowledgement that you should be expecting a check in the exact dollar amount that was provided on that letter. Now the big question, let's say you get started on reconciling and you're going through all of your AT&T CalNet 3 invoices, and let's say each month's invoice is 150 pages long. You're trying to find all of those long distance charges and make sure you capture all of those ineligible fees, no matter how minor they are. You're running out of time. Well, according to the new rules, you have to file a request for an extension before the deadline. So if the deadline is October 28th and you know you can't meet it, file that request for an extension as soon as you know that you will not be able to meet that deadline. But keep in mind that you will only receive one extension of 120 days. Once that extension is granted, you have to get this process completed. If something comes up, and let's say it just falls up by the wayside, you think, oh, I've got 120 days, I can wait a few weeks, and then you forget about it, your deadline passes, notice that it says a second extension would require a quote-unquote very compelling waiver request. It would not be submitted to USAC, it goes straight to the FCC. Very compelling, in short, means it probably will not be granted. They're very stiff on this deadline. So I encourage you all to take advantage of the time that you have available right now to get your bears done. Make sure that all of your invoicing process is completed. At this time, I would like to open it up to questions. I know the process really is pretty simple until you start reconciling those invoices, and then you realize it can start taking some of your time to get those reconciliations done. So I do have a question coming up that says, we have not been getting AT&T credits. Is it too late to go back a few years? The thing with AT&T is they're in a unique position because of the CalNet 2 to CalNet 3 conversion. That conversion created a very large delay in anyone receiving their discounts because the funding simply wasn't approved until a year or so after the close of the funding year. And I know that AT&T's been struggling to make sure they get everything caught up. From what I understand, AT&T is actually finally getting to a position where they're getting things caught up. The question though is, can you go back a few years? At this point, not likely. If the process has not already been started on time, it's not likely that you can go back. If the process has been started and everything's been submitted on time, and AT&T is actually working on getting those discounts, then I wouldn't lose hope yet, but just be sure that you're communicating closely with whoever it is that's taking care of this process and your service provider. If you happen to be using a consultant in this regard, please keep in close communication with your consultant and respond as soon as you can to any questions that they may have. As you all know, so much of E-Rate is deadline driven, and depending on how many levels there are before you actually get a question, you may only be down to 2 or 3 days to respond to, whether it be an employee or a consultant or a service provider, and some of those deadlines are fixed. So unfortunately, it requires sometimes jumping when someone says jump, but funds are dependent on it, so we encourage you to respond quickly to questions that come in. And please, again, feel free to reach out to me, and if there's something that I can help with, I certainly will. For those of you who are a little bit newer to this process, again, like I mentioned, this is kind of the end of the E-Rate filing process. It can be very daunting if this is your first exposure, or maybe even not first, second, or third. It's still a huge process. Please feel free to reach out to me, and I can help walk you through where you are now and what you should be expecting in the coming months. one of the big things we have coming up in the E-rate world is called an online portal, and we will be reaching out to those who have not had a chance to set theirs up to make sure that they get it set up, because it will affect your funding and from this day moving forward on how you're able to file your forms and if you're able to file them successfully. Do we have any other questions? Okay, I want to thank you all for your time and your participation. Again, please remember, contact me at any time, and we'll be looking forward to future E-rate trainings where I encourage as many of you to attend as possible, only because of all the changes we've had going on in the E-rate world. Yes, this session has been recorded, and as soon as we get it edited and downloaded, we will get it posted. And not only will you receive a copy of the slides that were presented, you will also receive a link to the webinar. Thank you all very much.